Hi guys, welcome to another true crime story time, where I tell you one true crime case that was solved using forensic science, all while doing, and that's right, my makeup. Today's video will be featuring the It's a Mood palette from Colourpop because fall is coming up and I just cannot wait to start creating fall looks. I know it's August. I've already created one look with this palette before in the past. I will leave a link to that video somewhere here on the screen if you guys are interested in the first look I created. Oh my god, can't tell. All the other products I'm using in this video will be linked in the description below. Please read the disclaimer. I am not a professional forensic pathologist, nor am I a professional makeup artist. I'm just the average girl. Oh my god, what was that? Excuse me. I'm just the average girl at home like you, planning my makeup. Sometimes I do my nails while I talk about a true crime case. So if that's something that you're into, then you are more than welcome to stick around and hit the subscribe button. Also, quick reminder, the comment section is a privilege. Don't fuck it up. Now let's get into today's case. This all takes place in 1985 in Wichita Falls, Texas. That was a strange noise. Anyway, in Wichita Falls, Texas, where 23-year-old Toni Gibbs lived. Toni was a beautiful young woman and she worked as a nurse at the Wichita General Hospital. And on the early morning of January 19th, 1985, Toni was last seen leaving work headed towards her car. That was the last time anybody would see Toni alive. Fast forward 2 days later and Toni doesn't show up to work. Her friends and family members don't hear anything from her, so they become increasingly concerned and they contacted the police and put out a missing persons report. 2 days after the missing persons report was filed, Toni's car was found a couple of miles away from the hospital where she worked. It had been deserted. There was nothing inside of the car. There was no fingerprints, no sign of entry. Like it was just an abandoned vehicle pretty much sitting on the side of the road. It just seemed as though she kind of abandoned the car. Like I said, there was no other fingerprints in the vehicle outside of Toni's. It seemed as though Toni had just disappeared into thin air. Now we know that ain't true. On February 15th, just 4 weeks after Toni's disappearance, an electric worker discovered Toni's body in a deserted field a couple of miles outside of town. The field was located just outside of town along Route 281. As you can imagine, her family was completely devastated when her body was discovered. They didn't know what to do. They described it as a nightmare that just wouldn't stop, that wouldn't go away. First she was missing, now her body is found in a deserted field. They have no idea how she got there, and thus the investigation begins. When investigators arrived to the scene of the crime, they discovered that Toni had been stabbed to death, or it appeared as though she had been stabbed multiple times. She had multiple stab wounds to her chest, to her arm, to her back, all over. 100 miles away from her body, they discovered an old bus. Inside of the bus, they found Toni's clothing in there. They found Toni's blood inside. And it also appeared that she had been sexually assaulted. Based on the evidence at the crime scene, the investigators came to the conclusion that Toni had been stabbed inside of the bus and then had crawled out of the bus into the field, probably trying to find help, where she ultimately ended up dying. Not long after the discovery of Toni's body did investigators have a suspect. The suspect was 24-year-old Danny Laughlin. He was said to have been seen riding his bike near the field where Toni's body was found around the same time. So they pull him in because, you know, they want to talk to this Danny Laughlin. They want to find out if he had anything to do with Toni's death. Now Danny, he worked as a male stripper in town and he actually knew of Toni, or he knew Toni somehow. When investigators brought him in for interrogation, he started mouthing off and saying a lot of things about the murder that he shouldn't have been. He was talking like he knew about the murder. So they issued him a polygraph test, which he obliged to. He took the test and he did fail. He pretty much was planting himself as the killer, and you know, they couldn't figure out why. I mean, it looks like this is the guy right off the bat. I don't know why someone would do that, but I do know there's very weird people out there, you guys, who really are desperate to be a part of something, even if it's something terrible. Sadly, they really just want to be a part of anything, and they really want to get some sort of recognition, or I don't know what the hell he was trying to do. I guess he wanted to go to jail for whatever reason, I don't know. And with further investigation, police did discover that Danny and Tony knew each other. Tony had actually met Danny at a nightclub earlier on, so it makes a lot of sense. So everything was adding up and pointing to this Danny character being the killer. But was he really the killer? Or was he just making all of this up to get attention? They were about to find out. Who does that though? Like literally, who makes up shit like that? Like, I don't get it. I really don't. And I hope I never do. I mean, he went so far implementing himself as the killer that he was making comments about the field where her body was found, the position and where it was placed. Like, he was really putting himself there as the killer. This is the main reason why law enforcement do not like to release a lot of the information about the case up front to the public, because of crazy people like this guy, you know, can take some of the information and use it to manipulate things. So they like to keep it private so that when they're in an interrogation with the killer, if they reveal something, which oftentimes during interrogation, the killer usually reveals some sort of clue or some sort of information that only the killer would know, thus putting them at the crime scene and helping investigators solve the case a lot faster. During Tony's autopsy, the medical examiners also did a rape kit on her where they collected DNA evidence. They compared that DNA evidence to Danny's DNA, and the results came back inconclusive. But despite that, Danny Laughlin was still charged with Tony's murder. The prosecutors tried to argue their case that Danny was the killer. Although they didn't have any solid evidence, like any real evidence, they presented circumstantial evidence to the jury. But after 2 days of deliberation and with the lack of evidence, the case was thrown out. Because they did not have the evidence that they needed and they only had circumstantial evidence, one of the jurors were not convinced. And as you know, if one of the jurors are not convinced, you cannot come to a verdict or to a decision. So it got deadlocked. They couldn't really do anything. So at this point, a mistrial was declared and the case got dismissed. Actually, I said it wrong, you guys. It was only one of the 12 jurors who believed that Danny was guilty. The other jurors did not believe he was the killer. They felt like there was not enough evidence and the circumstantial evidence wasn't that strong. So they decided to not retry the case. 16 months would go by with no new leads, no new information regarding Tony's murder, until another murder took place. 21-year-old Tina Kimbrough. Tina was a waitress, and her family described her as the perfect daughter, that she was just like the all-around American girl. They said that she was a tomboy and a day, and then I believe her father described her as a debutante by night, he said. Tina was found dead in her apartment on her sofa. An autopsy report revealed that Tina had tiny fibers in her lungs. Forensic scientists compared those fibers to a pillow that was found on her sofa, and it matched. This led them to believe that Tina had been suffocated with the pillow on her couch. However, this time they didn't find any signs of sexual assault. So it was a different style of killing than that of Tony's. So they didn't really link the two girls together at the time. You guys, I felt so sorry for her father, because he was just like, it's been 16 years, but it really feels like it's been 16 days, 16 minutes, 16 seconds, 16 centuries. Like, he just felt like it's been forever. Now, police talked to all of the neighbors in Tina's apartment building, and they said that they actually saw a man leaving Tina's apartment or around Tina's apartment 5 hours before her body had been discovered. When investigators asked the neighbors to describe the person that they saw, they said that he was 6'2", he was Caucasian, he had dark brown hair, and he was wearing a baseball cap. I don't know how they saw his hair if he was wearing a baseball cap, but you know, it's because it was dark and he was wearing a baseball cap. I don't know how they could have saw his hair, but maybe they did. They said that the guy was running away from Tina's apartment. I would have called the police then, honestly. Is there like a patch in my head here? I feel like there is. You guys see that? Girl, why do I look like a comb head right now? Now, because Danny Laughlin did not match the description of the suspect, he was eliminated as a suspect in Tina's murder, and the two cases were not linked. So now investigators are working on Tina's case, and they have no leads in her case, and they still have no leads in Tony's case either, until a man named Farron Wardrip, who lived in Galveston, Texas, called police to let them know that he had some information about Tony's case. What's happening now? He didn't even live in the city where all of this was taking place. The place where the murder took place was in Wichita, and he was calling from Galveston, which was about 400 miles away from Wichita. Police decided to follow up on the lead because this was really interesting. What would a guy 400 miles away know about a case that happened all the way in Wichita? So Farron told police that he knew Tina because he had met her one evening at a bar she was waitressing at. And you know, he befriended her. They became really good friends. Now, Farron Wardrip, he worked odds and end jobs here and there, and he had a drug problem. He actually worked in hospitals as an orderly before. So he and Tina became really good friends, and Tina actually knew about his drug problem, according to him, and she really tried to help him out with it. She knew he was struggling. Surprisingly, he was forthcoming and admitted to police that he had murdered Tina. He said he killed Tina because one night when he went over to her place, she reminded him of his ex-wife, and he just snapped and killed her. And he said this was right before or right after the divorce with his wife. During the time he was telling his story about what happened between him and Tina, he was blaming a lot of it on his ex-wife, Jonna. He was saying that a lot of his problems in his life occurred because of Jonna and all of the things he was going through with her. And this divorce, you know, it just really drove him to the limit, and he couldn't take it anymore. Honestly, I don't know what to think about that. You know, I really kind of like caught off guard that he actually admitted it just like that. Like, it really didn't take the police pressing him at all. In fact, the entire time while he was, you know, telling them the reason for him murdering Tina, he just kept saying like Jonna was the real problem because she gave him a lot of shit and she wouldn't go to work and she just gave him a lot of problems. And basically he didn't take responsibility for anything. It was just all his ex-wife's fault, the entire thing. Like, how are you gonna come forward and say, yeah, you know, I killed somebody, it was wrong, but it wasn't my fault, it was my ex-wife's fault? Okay, dude, all right. That's a doozy, okay? That's a doozy. Now, investigators theorized that Wardrip most likely confessed because he knew that he was caught leaving that apartment, that he knew he had been seen. So the smartest thing for him to do was probably to come forward and confess, and they would most likely go easy on him. Farron was sentenced to 35 years in prison for the murder of Tina. However, a few years later, in 1997, he was given parole because he was such a good prisoner, I guess. He was on his best behavior in prison. He had started going to church. He had decided to change his life around and give his life and soul to Jesus, according to him. He stopped doing drugs, and he said he really took this as his opportunity to change his life around. He did everything according to the rules, so they let him out early. They released his ass. Can you believe that, you guys? I still don't get it. I just don't get it. Somebody has to explain it to me. I'm all with giving people second chances except for murderers, okay? And child M's, you know what I'm talking about. Now, after his release, Wardrip moved to Olney, and that's about 142 miles northwest of Dallas. And so he was living over there in the small town. He actually got married and started a family there. And he became really well respected in the town because people saw him as a person who did some wrong things in his life, but ultimately changed his life around and gave himself to Christ. He was a very active member in the community. He was involved in the community church, working with children. And people actually in the community started to respect him and see him as a person who changed his life around and given his life to God. And I guess they just saw it as, you know, a testament to Christ. Now, during this time, he was required to wear an ankle bracelet, and investigators did track his movements around town. Like, they made sure that he wasn't going nowhere. His movements were very restricted. He could only go to church, home, and work. Now, as you can imagine, Tina's father was completely heartbroken about this when he discovered that Farron Wardrip got out early, because he expected him to spend the rest of his life, or at least all of the 35 years, in prison for Tina's murder. If I was a father, I'd have to come for him. Farron was doing so well in his new life. He had the support of his family members and friends. He had his father and his mother and his 8 siblings supporting him. Because he got his high school diploma in prison, he was able to get a job at the Olney Door and Screen Company. So it really did appear like he had changed his life around and become a new person. But did he? While Farron Wardrip was starting his life over, the district attorney in Wichita was still trying to solve Tina's case. The district attorney in Wichita had a little bit of a problem. In addition to Tony's case, which had gone unsolved, he now had 2 more cases of young women who had gone missing and then been found murdered. This was a huge problem. I got some big bird brows, y'all. I got some big bird brows today. We just gonna work with her. We're not gonna complain. Y'all, I'm sorry. I just read this. This man taught Sunday school in the church. Sunday school, baby. Grasping for some common sense, but I'm not getting it. With further investigation, police found out that Tony Gibbs was not the first nurse that had been murdered in that town. There was another young nurse by the name of Terry Sims. Terry Sims was a 23-year-old Midwestern University student. She worked as a part-time EKG specialist in a hospital at that time that was called the Bethania Hospital, I believe. On December 21st, 1984, this is before Tony Gibbs' murder, Terry was at a Christmas party, and then she was supposed to go to a co-worker's home to study and spend the night. But then unexpectedly, her friend, whose name was Liz Boone, the one that she was supposed to stay the night with, got a call to come back in to work the night shift. So she ended up giving Terry a ride to her apartment and then giving her the keys to go inside and just dropping her off there and leaving to go into work. I think I called her Liz. Her name is actually Liza Boone. She dropped Terry off at around 12 a.m. in the morning and left her at her apartment alone. Now it's time to go into the palette. Oh my God, look at those fall shades. But anyway, back to the story. Okay, so Terry is in Liza's home in her apartment alone. The following morning when Liza returned home, she found her friend Terry lying in a pool of blood on the floor. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death several times. Oh my God, it's time to move, girl. It is time to move. Now, it was later determined by investigators that Terry had heard some commotion going on outside of the apartment after her friend left, and so she went outside to see what was going on. That is when she opened the door and this guy lunged inside with a knife and started to attack her. Oh my freaking God, this is a nightmare. I have a crazy neighbor downstairs, and I might do a story time about it, so you guys tell me if you want to hear it. But he is seriously insane. I have like voice recording footage and video footage of this neighbor, and yeah, I'm not gonna go into the details, because if you guys want to hear story time, I'll tell you. But there's just been a whole bunch of commotion. My landlord has tried to get him evicted and get him out of here, but she can't because of COVID. There's so much craziness to unpack, and it's been over a year now. It's been a year now that I've been dealing with this. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it just because I'm living in the situation now, and I didn't want to bring more attention to it because I felt like it would make me have even more anxiety around it. But really, it's an interesting story. It was later determined that Terry had heard something outside of the apartment later that night and some sort of commotion, and she opened the door to the apartment to see what was going on, and a man then lunged inside at her with a knife. She tried to fight him off. She went back inside of the apartment and closed the door to lock him out, and somehow he was able to break the door down and come in and come after her. And he ended up sexually assaulting her and stabbing her several times. According to the autopsy report, she survived and was still alive 4 minutes after her fatal attack. So she kind of had to she sat there in that for at least 4 minutes of fear and agony and pain. I don't want to imagine. No, we're not going to go there. We're not going to go there. It's horrific. Because this attack was so similar to Tony's murder and attack, police did start to put the pieces together. However, at that time, they didn't have any suspects. They were able to link the pieces together and see that this was actually the start of a series of murders with young women. Common sense started to kick in, and they were like, we might have a serial killer on our hands. I don't know, guys. What do you think? Seems like it's starting to match. Both of the victims' murders were very similar to each other. Terry and Tony's case were very similar in the fact that they both worked at hospitals. They both were attacked and sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. Terry was stabbed 7 times while Tony had been stabbed 8 times. There was no real solid suspects in Terry's murder until law enforcement got a break in the case when they discovered a bloody fingerprint on the side of Terry Sims' shoe. This fingerprint was sent to the forensics lab for testing and then preserved for future DNA technology. They pretty much reserved it for the future because at that time they didn't have any solid suspects to compare the DNA to, so they just saved it for future reference. Now, a year after Tony's death, another young woman named Ellen Blau had been found murdered. Ellen was a 21-year-old waitress and a part-time student at Midwestern University in Wichita Falls. Ellen disappeared on September 19th, 1985. Ellen had just finished her shift at the bar and she was walking on her way to her car. And out of nowhere, she was bull rushed and attacked. The attacker pushed Ellen into her vehicle and forced her to drive all the way to the outskirts of town, where she was strangled and left in the grass. The killer then drove Ellen's car back in town, where he just deserted it on a road. and days later, Ellen's body was discovered in the field. Unfortunately, her body was so badly decomposed because of the amount of heat during that season that they were unable to get a clear identification of her right off the bat. So they had to send her teeth to a forensic odontologist so that she could be matched by or identified by her dental records. The medical examiner did perform a rape kit on Ellen. However, they were unable to determine whether or not she had been sexually assaulted. And so for the next 14 years, all 3 of these murders would go unsolved. So the district attorney had all of these cold cases sitting on his desk, and at this point he started to notice the similarities. And so he told his lead investigator to take a look at all 3 cases and to see if he could find anything that would potentially solve this case. So the lead investigator actually knew Tony Gibbs personally. His wife knew Tony Gibbs, and he said that he and his brother had went out and personally looked for Tony when she first disappeared many years ago. So this was a pretty personal case for him, and he really wanted to solve her murder. So on a hunch, he decided to ask the forensics lab to compare the DNA found at the crime scene from Tony Gibbs to the DNA that they found from Terry Sims' autopsy. And what do you know? It matched. At this point, law enforcement knew that they had a serial killer on their hands. Now, the reason why they hadn't made the connection before between the cases is because there was different bureaus working on the different cases, so they weren't the same investigators, and these agencies did not have a lot of communication between each other about the cases, so they just never knew because they weren't communicating, basically. The lead investigator was pretty excited about this discovery because it meant that he was only looking for one suspect, and which was the serial killer, instead of like 3 different suspects. At this point, years had passed. I mean, like years, 14 years. So it was going to be quite difficult for law enforcement to find the evidence that they needed. With further investigation into the 3 cases, the lead investigator found that while Farron Wardrip was in custody for Tony's murder, the lead investigator on the case at the time asked him if he knew Ellen Blau. And shockingly, you guys, he also admitted to knowing Ellen. For whatever reason, law enforcement did not pursue that lead, and I would just make the wild guess it was because they already had him for Tony's murder. Oh my god, my hair looks like a Cheeto puff ball. Ugh, girl, we gotta do this. There was a video of Farron Wardrip talking in prison about the case, and he actually says, like, you know, it was ridiculous because I told them that I knew Ellen Blau, and if they would have just paid a little bit more attention, they would have easily been able to see that it was me the entire time. And he was pretty much like, I don't know why they never pursued the lead. I gave them the information. I knew that I left clues behind. I wasn't the cleanest murderer. You know what I noticed? This guy has a real knack for blaming things on other people. You know, oh yeah, sure, I committed all of these murders, but it's the police's job to, you know, figure it out, and it was the police's job to catch me, and they didn't catch me, so what can I say, you know? I mean, he does have a point, though. He does have a point. They've dropped the ball for sure on that one. With further investigation, they also found that Ellen Blau's best friend Jamie lived just down the hall from Farron Wardrip during the time of her murder. They also found out that Ellen Blau lived just a few blocks from where Carrie Sims lived, the other victim. Like, the girls literally lived that close to each other. Now, the lead investigator on the case, when he saw this, he says that it really just came together for him in his head, because the fact that these 2 cases, these 2 girls were living only like blocks away from each other, and they were just handled by 2 different investigative agencies, and that's the only reason why. Like, pretty much nobody was talking to anybody. And get this, you guys, Farron Wardrip worked as an orderly at the same hospital as Tony Gibbs. This put him as a direct suspect now. He had already been tied to her death, so this just really tied things together for them. In addition to that, Tony's car was also found abandoned in the same neighborhood that Farron Wardrip lived in. I mean, God, can there be more signs pointing to this guy? So now the lead investigator on the girls' 3 cases decided to go to Only, Texas to see if he could collect the DNA samples that was found at the girls' crime scenes. Because as you know, Tony Gibbs and Tina, they had been sexually assaulted. So he wanted to get the semen from the rape kits to see if he could match it to Farron's DNA. Now, remember, Farron Wardrip at this point in time had moved to Olney, Texas. I'm sorry if you're from there. I just never heard of that city, so I don't know how to even begin to pronounce it. He is now living in Olney, Texas. He has been living there since he was released from prison. And oh my God, I mean, he's about to get confronted for this shit. Now, the lead investigator on the case, he didn't have a warrant to collect Farron Wardrip's DNA at this point. So he had to figure out a way to get the DNA from Farron so that he could compare it to the girls' rape kits, right? Oh my God, this is where I get excited. I just love the creativity of solving cases, you know, of figuring it out, like see how they're going to do it. He was staking out Farron Wardrip's job, and he saw Farron working. He saw Farron was drinking a cup of coffee, and at some point Farron had got down off the forklift that he was driving outside, and he put this cup of coffee down somewhere in the trash bin. He put it in a trash bin. The lead investigator said that everything within him wanted to jump out of his car and run and get that DNA, just collect it quickly out of the trash bin before, like, he was like, I gotta get that DNA. But at the same time, he didn't want Farron to know who he was, that he was kind of undercover, I guess you could say, but he didn't want Farron to suspect anything. So obviously he wasn't gonna just run up like that, but he had to play it cool. And he just casually got out of his car, walked over to Farron and was like, hey. At that time, he said that he stuffed his mouth with tobacco, so he was chewing a huge wad of tobacco, and he was just like, hey man, you know, you got a cup that I can spit in? And Farron was like, sure. And he was like, help yourself, and pointed to the trash bin. And the lead investigator said when he looked into the bin, to his surprise, there were dozens of these fucking cups, of these coffee cups in the trash bin. So what were the chances that he could grab a cup that was the cup that he needed, that was Farron's? How could he be sure that the cup that he grabbed was Farron's cup and it wasn't just someone else's or some random cup? At the same time, he had Farron standing over his shoulder and watching him, like staring at him. So he had to make a really quick decision. It wasn't like he could sit there for like 3 to 4 minutes and be like, oh, which cup is it? He had to really, really use his intuition and decide right off the bat which cup he was going to take. And he did. He said he quickly looked at the cup, and on one of the cups he noticed that there was some Cheez-It crumbs, or crumbs from a cheese cracker that he saw Farron eating just a few minutes earlier. He took a wild guess, and he just said this most likely is the cup out of all the dozens of other cups here, and he chose that cup. Now, one of the reasons they also had to do it this way is because they didn't want there to be any search and seizure problems. So it needed to be an item that Farron had abandoned, that was just trash. Otherwise, they would have had to go through some sort of law, and it would have taken longer and permitted them from collecting the evidence. And probably Farron just didn't have to give it to them at this point because, like I said, they didn't have a warrant, most likely. The cup was immediately sent over to the forensic lab for DNA testing. The forensic scientists tested the cup for skin cells. Now, there was a little bit of coffee still in the bottom of the cup, as well as the cracker crumbs on the rim of the cup. And because of this, the forensic scientist felt very, very confident that she could find some DNA. Now, according to the forensic scientist, she swabbed the cup for epithelial cells, and it was actually the cotton swab that she used for the extraction of the DNA. She then compared the DNA she found on the coffee cup to the semen found at the two girls' crime scenes. And what do you know? It matched. Farron Wardrip was in fact the serial killer they were looking for. But they weren't done yet. Just because the DNA profiles match, they still needed to be sure. So to find out how often this DNA profile occurs in the general public, the forensic scientist performed another test. This test is called a DQ alpha test. The DQ alpha test is a particular location on chromosome 6. Ultimately, she came to the conclusion that Farron Wardrip's DNA was very, very rare. According to her, it was a 1.34, which was not very common in the general population at all. According to the forensic scientist, his profile was so rare that it would only be expected to occur once in the world's general population. That's crazy. At this time, the forensics lab in Austin, Texas was able to lift the print that they found on Terry Sims' shoe. This would also be a huge piece of evidence in solving her case. So once they lifted the prints from Terry Sims' shoe, they then compared it to Farron Wardrip's prints. And of course, it matched. This was a very powerful piece of evidence in solving the three girls' cases. Farron Wardrip was arrested, and during his interrogation, he revealed something that police did not know. During interrogation, Farron Wardrip confessed to all three girls' murders. And not only that, he gave investigators another piece of information that they didn't know. He told police that he killed another woman. Her name was Deborah Taylor. Also, the lead investigator on the case couldn't help it. So during interrogation, he did ask him, "Do you recognize me?" And Farron was like, he acted like he didn't recognize him, and he was like, "I was the guy that asked for your cup. That's how I got your DNA," pretty much. And it was like, oh shit, you know. According to Farron, 2 months after Tony Gibbs' murder, he left Wichita and headed to Fort Worth, Texas, where he met Deborah Taylor. He said while visiting a neighborhood bar, he met Deborah Taylor. She was a wife and a mother of 2. Deborah had been at the bar with her husband, but her husband got tired, and so he had left the bar a couple hours early, and Deborah stayed behind. "Girl, you should have took your ass home. It was time to go home. He left, you need to leave too." Like absolutely, it was time to go home. But you know, she still wanted to party and have some fun, so she stayed at the bar, and that is when she met Farron Wardrip. Now, Farron, he asked her to dance, and the two started dancing, and they got along really, really well. After they had a couple of dances and it was time to go home, Farron offered Taylor a ride. Taylor accepted Farron's offer, and as they were walking out to the parking lot, that is when Farron decided to make advances on Taylor. When Taylor denied his advances, he pushed her into the car and he killed her. Farron then dumped her body at a remote construction site, and 1 week later, workers found her body. But now get this, you guys, this is the effed up part. Deborah Taylor's husband was actually the main suspect in her murder, and he remained a suspect for 14 years after her murder. Now, although he was never officially charged with his wife's murder, it did pretty much ruin his life. I mean, you guys know how these cases go. It's usually the spouse. So people were thinking that he actually that he did kill his wife. He killed Deborah. Even his own family thought it was him and had turned against him. Deborah's family, his wife's family, had turned against him, his in-laws, his friends. Now, you guys remember Danny Laughlin, the guy in the beginning who was pretending like he was the serial killer because for whatever reason he's a psychopath, I don't know, but he wanted attention. Well, the new DNA testing actually exonerated him, although he was originally a suspect, but then he was never tried and convicted because he wasn't the real effing killer. Although I still think he should have spent some time in prison just to give him a wake-up call to to stop fooling around with people like that. That's not funny at all. Do not pay any attention to my hair. I'm begging you. I'm gonna do something about it in a minute. Right now it's just a little cheese puff ball. Now, although Danny Laughlin was exonerated of the murder, he wouldn't live long enough to see it. Unfortunately, 3 years prior to this, Danny Laughlin had gotten into a car accident and he passed away. So he wouldn't even live to see his exoneration. Thanks to forensic science and some good police work, on October 4th, 1999, Farron Wardrip pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to death by lethal injection. According to Farron, during an interview, he said that he never once thought that he had gotten away with it, that he knew that he left mountains of evidence behind for investigators. And he just really didn't understand why investigators did not piece together who the killer was from the beginning. It was almost like he wanted to get caught. He said he really didn't understand why investigators weren't more careful, why they didn't just pay a little bit more attention, because if they had paid more attention, they could have very easily figured out that he was the killer from the get-go. And yeah, it was a very interesting interview. If I can find it, I'll leave it for you guys somewhere. But if you guys have time, go and check it out. What did you guys think about this case and my makeup look? Please let me know in the comments down below. If you like videos like these, you can check out some of my other episodes. I'll leave them linked on the screen right here or right here. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. Please share because it really helps me out. And I'll see you guys next time with another true crime story time. Bye.